Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the work group meeting for the modifications to the Clean Cars for All guidelines. We are going to get started here in a couple minutes and give everyone else a chance to join in. We'll probably get started about 3 or 4 minutes after the hour. So just hang in there just for a minute. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. So welcome to the work group meeting on the modifications to the guidelines for the Clean Cars for All program. This is our second public meeting that we've hosted on this topic. My name is Anthony Poggi, and I'm the lead staff for Clean Cars for All. Today, along with my manager, Aaron Hilliard, and colleagues Kwa Yoon and Tiffany Nguyen, I will present and discuss the Clean Cars for All program, as well as the proposed modifications to the guidelines. Before we start, I want to walk through some virtual housekeeping. Please make sure your name is complete and accurate as the Zoom participant. For security purposes, we cannot allow anonymous participants. My colleagues will help with question and answers and opening lines for comments. During the question and answer session, please raise your hand to let us know that you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. Once your line is open, you can go ahead and speak. Please make sure to state your name and your affiliation at the beginning of your comments. For those of you who are participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand, and then we will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. If you haven't already noticed, today's work group is being held in a meeting format rather than a webinar. This means that we will be using a chat box rather than a Q&A box for you to ask written questions. We'll try our best to make sure we answer every question in the chat box, but please feel free to resubmit your question or raise your hand if you feel like a question in the chat box is not being answered. The agenda for this meeting, as well as a draft regulatory language, have been posted to the Clean Cars for All meetings and events webpage, and I'll drop a link in the chat so that you can access it easily. And for everyone's information, this meeting is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted to the Clean Cars for All meetings and events page in the next couple of weeks. We have 2 hours to cover all the topics, and at the end of the presentation, we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for you to ask and for us to answer your questions. So as far as the agenda for today, I'm going to be covering program background and some recent developments, including the funding plan changes that were approved in November, proposed regulatory changes, and then get on to our next steps and some timelines, and then end with the Q&A session. So let's begin with some background and recent developments. Clean Cars for All is administered through participating air districts and focuses on providing incentives to California drivers to scrap their older, high-polluting car and replace it with a zero or near zero emission replacement vehicle. The program aims to focus benefits to low-income and disadvantaged communities and has a heavy emphasis on consumer protections, education of the new technologies, and coordination with other clean transportation programs. Program funding comes annually from multiple sources: greenhouse gas reduction funds and air quality improvement plan funds, as well as a one-time allocation of Volkswagen mitigation funds. The 2021-2022 funding plan was approved by our board in November of last year. It included $75 million for Clean Cars for All. $25 million of this money was allocated evenly to South Coast, San Joaquin, and Bay Area air districts prior to the funding plan, as permitted by provisions in the previous funding plan. The total allocations for 21-22 fiscal year are as follows: $28 million for South Coast AQMD, $15 million each to Bay Area and San Joaquin, $2 million to Sacramento AQMD, and $5 million to San Diego so that they may begin implementation of their new Clean Cars for All program. Additionally, $10 million was allocated as a strategic reserve, which is eligible to be allocated to any participating air district according to program demand. The grants for the full allocations are currently in development, and we expect to send them to the districts next month. Because we were able to get the $25 million of contingency funds out early, prior to the funding plan passage last November, 3 of 4 air districts with existing programs are now open to new applications. Sacramento Air District is currently closed to new applications as they continue to work through a backlog of previous and existing applications. I'd like to take this opportunity to address the issue of 1099s in the Clean Cars for All program. Last year, including at the funding plan board hearing, staff received feedback about the importance of eliminating 1099s for Clean Cars for All program participants. Currently, 2 air districts administer 1099s to their participants. CARB understands that issuing 1099s can be detrimental to the goals of the program, including reducing or eliminating participants' eligibility for other income-based programs. CARB has heard from participants who experienced a change in eligibility for other programs, as well as them being affected by increased tax liability from the grant received from Clean Cars for All. CARB does not issue 1099s for incentive programs which it administers and recognizes the importance of a program-wide policy of not issuing 1099s. Now I'm going to move on to changes in Clean Cars for All that were approved in the funding plan, and then talk about the regulatory updates that we need to implement, that we need to complete in order to implement those changes. In addition to the funding allocations, the funding plan outlined changes for the Clean Cars for All program, including a statewide expansion and enhancements to program flexibility. The funding plan authorized CARB's executive officer to make changes to Clean Cars for All prior to the next year's funding plan. These changes include statewide expansion, modifying eligible technology types, and household income eligibility. Executive officer authority to enact these changes permits full implementation of the updated policies following the conclusion of our public processes and filing of the updated guidelines with the Office of Administrative Law. As many of you know, in 2018, CARB adopted a regulation which codified the Clean Cars for All guidelines. And in order to expand the program statewide and allow the changes approved in the funding plan, staff must make focused changes to those guidelines. The first change I would like to discuss today in the regulation is concerning statewide expansion. The proposed regulatory language removes the requirement which limits the program to air districts with populations greater than 1 million residents. Removing this requirement will make every district in California eligible to run a Clean Cars for All program. Another proposed modification is to allow a third-party administrator to run Clean Cars for All for smaller districts who may not have the administrative capacity to conduct tasks such as required outreach and education. In order to achieve this, the proposed regulation redefines administrator as any air district or third-party entity or organization selected by CARB through a public process to implement Clean Cars for All. This modification will not affect the 4 air districts with existing programs or San Diego, which will maintain the ability to administer their own programs. In addition to changes related to statewide expansion, the proposed regulation makes focused changes to improve program flexibility and streamline program administration as approved by the board in the funding plan. So the next change I'm going to talk about concerns vehicle technologies and which technologies are eligible for Clean Cars for All funding. The 2021-2022 funding plan also allows CARB to consider participating administrators' plans to limit eligible replacements to the cleanest technologies. This update in the regulation would not remove vehicle technologies from the program altogether, but would provide CARB the flexibility to approve district plans to eliminate eligible replacement vehicle technologies, provided that the district has vetted those plans through its own public process. So in order to accommodate this, the regulatory language has been changed to allow program administrators to require the cleanest technologies. The administrator may exclude an eligible replacement technology if it meets the replacement vehicle goals set by the board for the previous year's funding plan, and the changes are set forth in their implementation proposal. The next change I'm going to discuss involves lowering the eligibility for lowering the income cap for Clean Cars for All. So last year we received comments suggesting limitation of the program to participants below the 300% federal poverty level threshold. Currently, 90% of our program funds are directed towards participants below that 300% FPL threshold. Furthermore, the program's expansion statewide will bring in additional stakeholders, as well as the new stakeholders in San Diego, who have not yet had the opportunity to provide their perspective on such a program-wide limitation. So rather than across the board statewide lowering of the income cap, the 21 to 22 funding plan includes flexibility for CARB to approve districts' plans who wish to limit income eligibility and focus funding to the lowest income thresholds. CARB does have the ability to institute limits program-wide through a public process if this is later determined to be appropriate. In order to allow this flexibility, the regulation adds language allowing the administrator to reduce the eligible income cap, as long as it meets the goals set by the board for the previous fiscal year and the requirements in the health and safety code, and the changes are set forth in the district's implementation plan. So the main theme throughout these flexibilities that we're talking about here is that first, they're allowed in the regulation, then the district can show us an implementation plan if they want to carry out with any of these flexibilities. And we want to see the districts conduct their own public process as well, so they've gotten feedback from their own communities. And if the implementation plan is then approved, then the district may request a grant amendment to make the necessary changes for them to carry out those flexibilities or changes to their own programs. So in addition to statewide expansion and program flexibility, there's a few relatively minor changes I wanted to cover today. One is the definition of electric vehicle service equipment known as EVSE. The regulation adds a definition for EVSE to match existing definition in California statute. This will not change the types of EVSE that districts can fund or that they have been funding. Another minor change is to define survey data. The data in the survey data definition, the proposed regulation explicitly, or I should say the requirement, not the definition, explicitly includes replacement vehicle satisfaction, program satisfaction, charging needs, and participant feedback. And again, these items are now defined in the proposed regulation As we all know, the surveys are not limited to this information, but these are now codified in the proposed regulation. The last minor requirement I wanted to cover is, or minor change, I should say, is in addition to the eligibility, the proposed regulation adds California residency as a requirement for program eligibility. So in addition to enabling program expansion and flexibilities, our goal with this rulemaking is to maintain community-focused outreach, education, and consumer protections that are not only required, but crucial to our program success. I want to take this opportunity to reiterate that modifications made to this rulemaking process regarding a third-party administrator will not affect existing district programs or the upcoming program in San Diego. The purpose for this rulemaking is not to make policy changes to the program. It is to allow policy changes that were approved already through the previous funding plan and through future annual funding plan processes. I'm now going to go over next steps and some timelines for what's coming ahead for our program. The first next steps I want to talk about are the regulatory changes, what comes next after this meeting. So two bills signed last year, AB 128 and AB 148, give CARB the authority to amend the Clean Cars for All guidelines through a procedure known as file and print. This requires CARB to submit the amended regulatory language as well as a memo to the Office of Administrative Law. This streamlined procedure does not require a public process, but in order to preserve transparency and our valued input from our stakeholders, staff outlined these changes to the public during our board hearing in November and during public meetings in August of last year and today. Once the regulation is filed with OAL, the Office of Administrative Law, it should be finalized with the Secretary of State within 30 days. Staff expects the regulation to be completed in March of this year, meaning that's when it will be sent to the Office of Administrative Law. Once that is complete and it's filed with Secretary of State, program administrators may begin to submit updated implementation plans if they wish to modify their programs and take advantage of the flexibilities allowed in the funding plan. Once that implementation plan is approved, then the districts may request a grant amendment and allow enactment of those changes for their individual programs. So the next item for next steps is concerning statewide solicitation, statewide expansion of our program. So the timing of this is going to depend in part on the California state budget process. While the legislature last year signaled intent to support the expansion of Clean Cars for All, there is no funding specifically allocated for statewide expansion. The draft budget that recently came out included $256 million for all equity projects, including Clean Cars for All. So that's promising, but as we all know, the budget will not be official until it is passed by the legislature later this year. So with that bit of uncertainty in mind, CARB staff wants to do everything we can to set the stage through regulatory updates and development of the solicitation for the statewide administrator to enable expansion as quickly as possible. Staff plans to release a copy of the solicitation materials for the statewide administrator in spring of this year and hold a public meeting to present and discuss the materials with stakeholders. We plan to open the solicitation for a statewide administrator in late spring or early summer. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to give the attendees an opportunity to ask questions or provide comments. During this session, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. Once your line is open, you'll need to unmute yourself to speak. I think on Zoom, you may have to do that. If you're on the phone, you'll get a notification that your line has been unmuted, and then I believe you can start speaking. So please make sure to state your name and affiliation at the beginning of your comment or question. And for those of you who are participating via phone, please press #2 to raise your hand. You may also use the chat box to ask questions. So with that, I'll open it up.
Hi, everyone. It looks like we have Christopher Chavez. Christopher, I've asked you to unmute your mic.
Sure. Wasn't expecting to come up to bat so quickly. Yes, my name is Chris Chavez. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at Coalition for Clean Air. Two quick questions. First, regarding the funding for Clean Cars for All. So could you provide a breakdown of, like, because I know part of the funding is dedicated towards statewide expansion, but also part of it's towards the air districts. And I think the issue at hand here is that for the air districts with currently operating programs, those are already up and running, and they run out of money pretty quickly. I think some of them are looking at running out in June. You had this amount also set aside for the statewide expansion, which may take place even further out in the future. So could you dive into a little bit about that? And I have one more question after that.
Sure. So the funding I discussed, the funding plan allocations, that was for the district specifically and for a strategic reserve. I don't know if maybe you misheard me, but I did state that there's no funding right now set aside for statewide expansion specifically. And we brought that up because funding until it's passed by the legislature is uncertain. So when we are developing the solicitation and depending on future allocations to CARB and to Clean Cars for All, as well as further studies of the potential populations in the statewide pool of applicants, then we will decide the amount of funding for statewide at that time. You had a follow-up question to that?
Yes, I did. I accidentally muted myself. It couldn't unmute myself again. Yeah, the second question was relating to the 1099 issue that a number of advocates, Chargehead California and others, have brought up about certain air districts issuing a 1099 to participants in Clean Cars for All, which really can lead to a nasty surprise tax bill when they have to file. So I wanted to see if there was any update from CARB or any additional information. I know CARB has has said that they think that there's some legislative guidance or some legal guidance that's needed, but just wanted to see if there's any update, because again, CVRP doesn't treat the program as taxable income, and we think that should also be the case with Clean Cars for All.
So we have been looking for the last several months into different avenues of some assurances we could get, but as I stated before, we don't believe it should be taxable. We don't, I should say, let me rephrase that. We don't issue 1099s for the programs we administer, but two districts currently do issue them. So as of right now, we don't have any resolution on that issue.
Do you know what it might take to get some resolution in that issue?
Right now, I can tell you that we're doing everything we can and talking to, trying to reach out to different agencies and different folks in government to kind of get a grasp on what it would take. But right now, I don't have a timeline for you.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Eric Barnes. Eric, I have unmuted your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm Eric Barnes with the Motorcycle Industry Council. And I know during past meetings I've brought this up, but motorcycles have long been an option for the low income community for transportation options. And I'd like to see if CARB can come up with a way to include motorcycles, zero emissions motorcycles, in the Clean Cars for All program. They may be helpful for quite a few individuals to get into a better vehicle or a vehicle to support their needs. If there's any way for you to consider electric or zero emissions motorcycles, that would be great.
Thanks, Eric. We're always looking for opportunities to meet all options for zero emission transportation. The motorcycle one is tricky, and I'm happy to follow up with you offline. I know that there's a statutory element that prevents us from doing that, but I'm happy to revisit that with you and look into it and see if at all it's possible for us to look at zero emission motorcycles. I do know we've talked about it in the past, but I have to refresh my knowledge on why exactly we haven't been able to do it previously, but I'm happy to follow up with you offline about that if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony, there are no more raised hands.
Okay. I'll give everyone just another minute or two. Perhaps for those of you, Tiffany did drop the link in the chat box, the link to the meetings and events webpage that has the draft regulatory language. If any of you happen to be looking in that now and have questions, or if you look at it in the near future and you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. We do have a new question in the chat that just came in, a couple that I can go through. Let's see. So this is from Niranjan Vashio. Excuse me if I mispronounce your name. He says, at the outset, we mentioned that goals for Clean Cars for All included air quality improvements. Can you comment on whether that exclusively focuses the program on carbon emission reductions, or whether it includes total or local air quality, i.e. criteria pollutant reductions via retirement of the highest emitting vehicles? So good question. While we're mainly funded by greenhouse gas reduction funds, as their name suggests, the primary target of those is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2. All of our replacements achieve criteria reductions as well. And so we achieve reductions of both criteria pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions with the replacements. And your last part of your question, via retirement of the highest emitting vehicles. Every air district, every program administrator moving forward is required to submit to us an implementation plan which identifies how they're going to target the highest emitting vehicles, whether that be a model year cap, meaning no vehicles that are newer than, let's say, 2006, and or requiring a smog check, a smog test. Those kind of things can make sure that they are targeting high emitting vehicles. So we do require that the districts and administrators strategize to target those high emitting vehicles. Janelle London says she cannot raise her hand, but wants to ask metrics around gasoline displacement. Janelle, I think gasoline displacement is not something we track very regularly, but we do when we report to the Clean Climate Investments reporting team. When they come out with a report twice a year, we do track the amount of fossil fuel gallons that have been saved by every GGRF funded project in Clean Cars for All. And so the Clean Climate Investments team has that data. I'm happy to follow up with you offline and help you get your hands on that. So you can take a look at those numbers if you would like.
Anthony, we do have a raised hand.
Sure.
Roman, I have asked you to unmute your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Roman.
Yes. Hey. Yeah, thank you for this. Apologies. I was running late and just joined recently, so sorry if my questions were already addressed. But I have two questions. One, and I actually see something on the chat already from Chris Chavez. But in the past we've addressed our concern about the 1099 form. So as the program is looking to go statewide, we're hoping that that also is addressed, right? And that there's direction of for whoever implements or whoever is added to the statewide administration does not issue 1099 forms for reasons we've stated in the past of creating additional barriers to low-income households. And the second is in regards to the charging or the additional incentive for charging infrastructure. I was curious whether there was thoughts of expanding the program similar to how like Clean Vehicle Assistance Program provides like a charge card, right, for those that can't install charging in their home or multi-unit dwelling. So I'm just curious whether that was addressed.
Say that one more time, Roman, the last part. What about the charge card for what's your question regarding charge cards? Sorry about that. If you don't mind repeating it one more time.
Oh, I'm sorry, he muted himself.
Okay.
Roman, I've unmuted you.
Yeah, sorry about
Roman.
that. Sorry.
What is your
I shouldn't
explicit question regarding charge cards?
Yeah, so under the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, I believe that if you can't install charging, right, and access the $2,000 that are provided extra as an additional incentive, there is an option to receive kind of a charge card, right, that allows them to access public charging. And I believe it's $1,000. And I'm curious whether under this program, there's a similar consideration to make sure that those that may not be able to install charging at home, that they have a similar option like that under Clean Vehicle Assistance Program.
So right now we do allow EV charge cards.
Okay, great.
Now there are 4 districts currently administering the program. Not all of them have that fully implemented yet, but as far as CARB is concerned, we do allow the charge cards to be funded in lieu of a home charging system, and it is the same amount of $2,000.
Oh, thanks, Anthony.
And then I think you also mentioned this, the 1099 issue for statewide expansion. We're going to be having additional public meetings regarding statewide expansion, as I did mention. So please feel free to, encourage you to participate and help us shape that solicitation going forward as we develop our solicitation materials and get feedback on that before we actually open it up for people to apply to be the administrator.
Okay, thanks, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Janelle, I see that you said you had asked to be unmuted. Do you mind raising your hand if you still want to ask your question, so that Aria can find you easily and unmute you?
Hey, Janelle, I went ahead and unmuted you.
Oh, thank you so much.
No worries.
I just wanted to follow up a little and add some clarification. So I heard you say that all the air districts are required to submit a plan about cutting vehicle emissions, and targeting high emitting vehicles is required. And so I think that's a great idea, but I think it might be missing an opportunity. So you might have a very high emitting vehicle that sits in your driveway. And so it's really like displacing, moving that vehicle or just retiring it isn't really addressing the issue of cutting gasoline consumption. And so I was wondering if there are any plans, or if there's room for any plans or recommendations for air districts to measure not whether it's a high emitting vehicle per se, but how much gasoline it's actually burning. So again, the high emitting vehicle that sits in the driveway is very different from a high emitting vehicle that drives 20, 30,000 miles a year.
Thank you very much. That's a good point. And we do require the districts test vehicle functionality and to make sure they're registered and insured, to try to assure that these vehicles are being used. We do have some baseline assumptions for what we assume the existing and new vehicle will be operating every year in terms of miles per year. If you think about it, really old vehicles, they're not going to be usually driven 30,000 miles a year. They're not reliable. These people aren't going to be commuting an hour each way in them. The types of vehicles that we're looking at are older. And I appreciate your point that a dirtier vehicle that hardly does any miles may not be emitting as much as a slightly cleaner vehicle. If the slightly cleaner vehicle is doing, like I said, 30,000 miles a year, but we do have steps taken to make sure that the vehicles we're replacing are used and are functional and not just sitting in a driveway collecting spider webs.
So you're actually collecting mileage driven in the EVs?
We have assumptions about the mileage driven in the EVs, and as we bolster our survey process, we are looking at lots of different types of data that we can gather from participants to kind of make our data set more robust and get more of those pieces of information. And miles driven in EVs is a good candidate for that. So that's something we can take into account moving forward.
Awesome. The one other thing would be a survey about at least estimates from the drivers about how much gasoline they were burning before they switched to the EV.
Thank you very much. We'll take that into account. We work with the districts ongoing about their survey development and what we'd like them to collect, and also how we can get a higher percentage of surveys returned to the districts. And so we can, all that data can be collected eventually by CARB. So I appreciate those points, and that's something that we either already have looking at or definitely can strategize for in the future. So thank you very much, Janelle.
Thank you.
So we have a question for Abraham Moreno about e-bikes. And he asked, are there plans to add e-bikes? E-bikes are currently an option under the mobility option for Clean Cars for All. So in addition to vehicle types, in addition to replacement vehicles that participants can choose from, they can also choose a mobility option, which can take the form of some sort of prepaid public transit card or a voucher to purchase an e-bike. So they are already allowed as part of the program.
It looks like Roman has raised his hand again. Roman?
Thank you, Arya. And this is just more of a procedural comment here. I'm looking at the additional link y'all sent for the program meetings and workshops, and I think CARB's website is already complicated enough, and the fact that we have to go an additional step to access the agenda and the updates, I think is something that should be here, but then also in the regular low carbon transportation workshop page, rather than having to go a step further. Because just from initially going, I was trying to find the workshop documents, and I didn't, because I showed up late, and it wasn't until someone told me that we had to go to an additional page. So if there could be a level of consistency there of having it all be part of one page, that'd be really helpful. And then two, in past workshops, I've also shared that it'd be great to get programmatic updates, and I'm not sure if that happened at the beginning, but I'm a visual person, and being able to see any type of visuals would be really helpful. Last year, the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program provided a very helpful presentation, and Clean Cars for All didn't. There was no slides, and so again, just as a procedural update to these types of workshops, of being able to have something to follow along with would be really helpful.
Thank you for your feedback, Roman. I appreciate it. I want to thank Beverly and Deschaux, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Thank you for your feedback. Are there any other raised hands or any other questions? We'll give everyone a couple of minutes.
It looks like we have a few more raised hands. Enid, I have unmuted your mic.
Thank you. My question is it possible to make the infrastructure incentive some sort of voucher instead of a reimbursement basis? It's very hard for low-income people to do a reimbursement.
Thank you so much for your question. So that's something that if that change would come again, and not through the regulation, that would be more of a funding plan development process. We'd have to look into the restraints on that. There are restraints on how we can spend our money and when we can reimburse. But Enid, thank you for bringing that up, and I'm happy to follow up with you offline and look into that for you.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have Jonathan Changus. Jonathan, I have unmuted your mic.
Thanks, Arya. And a busy day for the CARB staff and CARB team, as well as for the stakeholders participating. And just kind of along those lines, as we have the funding plan and some of these individual tracks along the way, just kind of is the funding plan probably the best form to kind of figure out and hear how financing assistance and clean cars for all and like the eligibility changes and such, potentially even with CDRP as well, how those are all going to kind of work together for, in particular, the low income segment households, to make sure that we're kind of prioritizing and optimizing incentives for those that are in greatest need of assistance. Is that kind of coordination about the different programs, not just looking at their own program rules, but how they work together? Is that kind of the funding plan probably the best place to keep track of those?
You're spot on, Jonathan. That's a good guess. Yes, that is the best place to address that, would be the funding plan. I know this is all confusing. It is Clean Cars for All. It is the funding plan, but this work group meeting and the specific program happens to have a statutory, has to have their guidelines are in statute and regulatory statutes. So we're meeting here today to talk about the change in statute, but you're right. The coordination and how the different programs requirements and any changes to those requirements are going to work together to make sure that we continue to target the right folks, and also to enhance targeting where at all possible will be done through the funding plan workshops and workgroup meetings.
Jonathan, I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to ask, but I unmuted you because participants are not able to unmute themselves.
Thanks, Aria. No, I appreciate that, Anthony. And I guess my encouragement, as some have heard before, is just, really appreciate the more that we can coordinate at the program level. As someone that lives and breathes in the administration space, the easier it is to try and create a more straightforward process for the communities and the households, individuals we're all trying to serve, especially in disadvantaged communities, especially those that have disproportionately borne the brunt of transportation pollution in the past, that are now trying to get access to the clean alternatives. The easier we can make that process across programs and to make sure that they're working in concert together, the more collectively we're able to do for those kind of shared interests. So glad to hear it, Anthony, and look forward to being part of constructive dialogue on how we can take next steps to further make improvements along the way to the process for low-income households in particular.
I appreciate that feedback, Jonathan, and I'll just reiterate that, yes, we're talking today about regulatory changes, statewide expansion, and the solicitation. We will have more public meetings and interaction, and the funding plan process, as always, will have several meetings, not just for Clean Cars for All, but for all the programs throughout the year. So this is not the one and only opportunity to comment on Clean Cars for All. There'll be a lot of opportunities. We encourage you all to be active and vocal as we shape the statewide solicitation and the next funding plan as well. I don't see any hands up. Let's see, what was the income cap again? Okay, Abraham Moreno asks, what was the income cap again? So the income cap right now is 400% of the federal poverty level, and currently about 90% of Clean Cars for All incentives go to the 250 and below. So what we heard from feedback from stakeholders last year was that they wanted us to reduce the income cap across the board from 400 down to 300. So, and let me correct what I said for a second. The 90% are currently already in the 300 and below, even though we allow up to 400. The funding plan that was approved in November provides some flexibility so that if an air district has a public process, meets with their community to get feedback on perhaps lowering that threshold to 300, and they include that information that they had their public process, they submit us an implementation plan to us, then an air district or an administrator would be able to lower that cap. But as it is right now, we are not lowering the income cap across the board currently. We have the ability now, thanks to the regulatory updates we're doing, to lower it, but at this time, especially with new participants coming into the fold, with statewide expansion and the new program in San Diego, we don't have data on those communities yet. We don't fully understand their needs and the people who are going to be in most need of the program. So until we get some data on those, we don't want to put restrictions on those programs before they don't even start. So thank you, Abraham, for that question. Okay, we'll wait about another minute or so. Oh, and thank you from one of my colleagues points out that 400% federal poverty level is equivalent to $106,000 a year for a family of 4. So that's what the current income cap is. Thank you, Kwa, for that bit of data. And again, we'll leave a little bit more time if anyone has a question come into mind before we end the meeting here. Like I said earlier, if any questions come up, feel free to email myself, and I'll make sure that we can have a dialogue and get you the answers that you're looking for. Okay, last call. I don't see anything in the chat, and we do not have any raised hand that I can see. Aria, please correct me if I'm missing something, but I don't think there are.
You're right.
Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and end this meeting. I want to thank everyone for participating and being a part of this process, and for your questions and your feedback. We will make sure that you're all made aware the next time we have a public meeting. And like I said, the most likely, the next public meeting we have will be regarding the solicitation for the statewide administrator. So with that, again, thank you for participating, and I really appreciate you all being here, and have a nice afternoon. Stay safe. Okay. Bye-bye.